Yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay, perfect. So, Nikki, thanks a lot for coming on. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, I've heard you the first time. I've heard you about you the first time on the this who what's the name of this guy? He also had me on the first time. His was I think his Instagram name is My Health Motivator, something like that. I think it was your first podcast too. You'd be like super excited, like, oh, geez, I'm being on podcast.
Yes, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, yeah. So you've been on his as well.
Yeah, he invited me right after he had you on, I believe. Um, so how how was your podcast experience been like since then? Because I believe you have been on couple other shows from that time on.
Yeah, yeah, I have been. Now I'm just trying to think when that was. I think that might have been around Christmas time. But that is that right?
Could be. It was like more than a year ago.
Yeah. Oh no, hang on. That was ages ago. Yeah. Fellow Aussie. Yes, sorry,
Exactly.
I was thinking of
Exactly.
another one. Yes, fellow Aussie, and he was my very first podcast, and I was
Hmm.
extremely nervous. Yeah, no, so I've been on a few since then, and it's been uh, really cool. Connecting with people that are on the same page about how they feel about nutrition, especially,
Hmm.
um, but the world too. So yeah, it's been really fun connecting with people all over the world, and this is what I love about what is available to us these days is that we get to connect with people just all over the world, and um, knowing as well that I feel like this community, there's a very small community of
Hmm.
people that are like minds in this space
Hmm.
in Australia, but it's not huge. I feel like there's a lot of
Right.
people from the US, but it is amazing connecting with people that are all over the world and making friends. So it's great.
Absolutely, and I feel like the community that celebrate animal foods, let's say, is starting to grow and expand more rapidly in the U.S. As you said, um, it's not as popular here in Europe, I suppose. Especially
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
it feels like Europe, Europe is like always a couple years behind the U.S. So now the vegan cult is
Oh
pretty
yeah,
prevalent here. It's like everyone likes to be vegan. That's pretty funny because that's
that's
it's kind of still a thing in the U.S. But there, as we said, the animal based community is trying. It grows larger and larger. More people seem to understand that they are valuable and that veganism is something maybe to look at with a critical eye. So let's talk about how you got there, because you had, if I remember correctly, you had an autoimmune history, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
absolutely, yeah. No, that's correct. I've always suffered with autoimmune conditions,
Hmm.
and I used to find it incredibly frustrating, actually. And I would hate to put poor health on anybody, but I used to get really frustrated because out of everybody in my family, everybody seemed to have amazing health, and for some reason, I just kept getting hit with all different weird and wonderful things. And
Hmm.
um, now, when I look back, it makes quite a lot of sense, I guess. Like a lot of things sort of stacking on top of each other. But being a cesarean birth, and then I kept getting sick with tonsillitis as a
Hmm.
4-year-old, and I had about 2 years where I just kept getting it, and so I was on a lot of antibiotics
Right.
for quite a while, and then I started to develop hay fever and asthma around the age of sort of five or six, and I've had that ever as far back as I can remember. And it was stressful for a little kid because you'd want to go over and hang out with friends at their houses and stay over and do sleepovers, and that was always quite stressful for me because they'd either have an animal or they'd just have a bit of dust, and I'd end up spending all night trying to breathe.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and then as I got older and into my teens, I started to sort of develop skin problems with my autoimmunity as well, and so then I was on this mission to try and combat that, and then also just weight fluctuations, and as a teenager that's something you try to look into, and so the further deep down I got into the nutrition space, the more I developed a passion for it, but
Right.
the more I was trying to heal my own body. And I think that in fact probably made my situation worse because then of course I started to study nutrition when I came out of high school, and of course
Hmm.
that was a very plant-based,
Oh yeah.
teaching. And so when I look back on it now, I think, okay, a lot of the issues, I think, unfortunately, were out of my control, but I think also were possibly made worse by my own choices and in trying to find the answer myself. And so I guess my issues kind of continued to develop and worsen as I went into my late 20s, and then kind of hit a bit of a head when I had my first little one.
Hmm.
She's now 5, and so when I had her, I guess that takes a toll on your body,
Oh yeah.
and I felt coming back out of it quite difficult. I couldn't shed the weight, and my gut issues sort of just kept worsening, my hay fever and my asthma, until one day I kind of just thought I need to sort this out. I really want to I want to hold on to my fertility because I wanted to have a second,
Sure.
and so that was on my mind, and so I went off, saw a natural health doctor, and we looked at some of my blood work, and I could see that there was a lot of inflammation going on, and so that started off my
Okay.
journey into looking at it from more of an inflammatory place. What's going on there?
Okay. Well, a couple things here. First, how well you were you able to distinguish between simply an allergic reaction, because many of your symptoms could be just put off as allergies, like asthma and like you itching or whatever. And
Yeah.
did you have any specific autoimmune diagnosis from a doctor or something like that, or was it more like a hypothesis? So this has probably something to do with autoimmunity.
I kind of just came to that really on my own. I do
Okay.
have one condition that I knew I'd been told at a young age that was autoimmune, and that's Raynaud's disease, which is a circulation problem.
Hmm.
And that, again, like all the other conditions, seemed to sort of come and go and then get worse as I got older. That was the one that I was aware of that was autoimmune. The others,
Hmm.
I guess I was always told that they were just allergies and that
Right.
that's just my lot. Um, and really, I didn't really have that much hope in being able to resolve the asthma and the hay fever, particularly. It was more about my weight problems that really got me into learning about autoimmunity, and it was just an interesting side effect, I guess, from finding this animal based diet and keto,
Right.
and seeing that, oh my gosh, I haven't had hay fever for a very long time, and oh, I haven't had asthma either. That's funny,
Hmm.
and then it started to become clear to me as time went on that, well, hang on a minute, I haven't really had any migraines lately, and I haven't my skin conditions have resolved, and it's sort of it's funny how you can live with these conditions all your life, or your as far as you can remember, but then sometimes it takes you almost forget that you even have them, and then if you get a flare up one day, or you get a headache, and you think, oh, that's funny, I haven't had a headache for years. So
Mm-hmm.
very interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The story you told with your pregnancy and then how things got worse after you got your first child, it reminded me of you're certainly familiar with the story of Michaela Peterson, I presume, because she had
Yes.
right because she her story was quite similar, that she had all these autoimmune symptoms which were extremely severe, and she started excluding a bunch of foods from her diet, and then all things got much better than that, and then suddenly she became pregnant and got her first child, and everything came back. So it's reasonable to presume that, well, during pregnancy a bunch of things happens, your body like changes in 1,000 different ways, and the hormones are completely nuts, and so obviously things are going to change. And
Yeah.
okay, so you said you found animal-based diets, and what exactly did you try out? Because autoimmunity and all these things are such a mystery, not only to me but to the medical establishment in general. And they pretend that they have all the answers, but um, on a on a on a more fundamental level, they still admit that, well, we actually don't know anything, because it's like you have all these beautiful medical terms like idiopathic or essential or this and that. So they believe that they coined a intelligent term for a disease, but in the end it just means we have no damn idea what caused this condition, which is quite funny. But it's particularly peculiar with autoimmunity, because I mean, for me, it's a stupid concept to just suggest that the body is so stupid that it attacks its own tissue. So, and that's why I just like hearing these stories like yours or from Michaela Peterson, because it just fascinates me to hear that people had issues and then they just resolved. So, what exactly did you do?
Well, and I just want to say on that note as well, it's
Sure.
an interesting topic, and it's one that I am really trying to get my head around specifically at the moment. I
Right.
have a close girlfriend who's got some liver issues, and she's young, and I want to sort of, so I've been doing this deep dive, and I'm studying dietetics, and we're getting pretty deep into the biochemistry at the
Right.
moment. I mean, I'm in year two, and every time the topic of autoimmunity comes up, we just don't go very far into it. And so it's from my own
Absolutely.
research that I'm really delving into it. And any second I get on my own where aren't there at the moment, I'm listening to things about it, and I'm trying to understand the biology of it. And even then, I still find the topic completely confuses me. And I can see how it could possibly. I can see how now that I look at what I have done over the last few years with eating more animal foods and excluding certain things, I can see how people that are eating the way that we've been told to eat, for so long, how these sort of conditions arise. And I kind of look at people now on the street and I think, how do they not have autoimmune when I think about the diet that we've been prescribed to do? So
Well,
then
look,
anyway, just
look. Quick comment,
yeah,
because so many people have issues. I mean, it's
yeah,
it would be an understatement to suggest that people are going around like being healthy. I mean, they're clearly all sick.
yeah,
They think, and so many conditions have become normal over the past years. Like people have migraines all the time, and that's like normal. You have like headache 3 times a week. Like who doesn't have a headache 5 times every day? Like that's
yeah,
perfectly normal. You get up and you feel miserable. Great. That's
yeah,
normal because everyone wakes up and feels miserable. I mean, obviously there are a bunch of factors, but I think the baseline health status has, well, it would be a bold statement to suggest that it has declined in some manner, because we do have less like disease. Well, it depends on the exact diseases that we're talking about, but I think many people are still walking around being extremely sick, and so now the question is there an autoimmune component or not? But
mm,
I get your point. It's not so serious that you have like um, that you have like rheumatoid arthritis or something that manifests itself in horrible symptomology. You don't have that most of the time.
yeah. I think interestingly, I mean, as I said to you, I've been quite fascinated by nutrition ever since I was about 12 years old. I started having weight issues, and so that really started my journey way back then. And even somebody like me, it took me till the age of, what was I, 30, to even start thinking, I wonder if diet is actually, I mean, I knew diet had a component to it, but I honestly, the conditions that I was so used to having, like the hay fever and asthma, headaches, as you said, even somebody like me who is so desperately trying to look for causes, even I couldn't really see that my conditions could have been fixed with diet particularly. I just thought they were my lot. And so, as you said, I mean, you people do get up every day thinking that, well, this is just normal. To go to a restaurant and eat and come home and have an upset stomach every time you go out, that's normal. That's what everybody gets, like that has become the normal. And I'll just mention as well, when it comes to healthcare, I mean, what's sad about it is that nobody fits within the healthy category anymore. So they moved the goalposts. I mean, I think it was iron recently that they could see that nobody was fitting within the iron recommended iron requirements. So they moved the goalposts so that people do.
Wow,
And it's like that's the way of doing it these days. And it's such a shame, because then
that's ridiculous.
people like us that go and get their blood tests done, they might see that they are out of the healthy normal range, and their doctor goes into a spin out, oh, you're low thyroid. But I do wonder now how many people are actually at perfect optimum health, if they feel fantastic, but yet they're not within the goal. And
Right.
do you see what I mean? I mean, they just move the goalposts. It's terrible.
Well, it's terrible, and it's also, I mean, it's a difficult problem to distinguish between what's healthy and what's normal, because these two things are not
Mm.
synonyms. So and you could describe the term normal as what categorizes the majority of the people. So that's a reasonable proposition. And then certainly you could shift the range, and then suddenly most people seem to be normal at this or that iron level, or pick whatever parameter you like. And then now the next question is, what is healthy and optimal, and should we have different ranges for that? I would argue that
Uh-oh.
it's stupid to go along to follow the definition of normal being what characterize the majority of the people, because if the majority of the people are not optimal and healthy, then what point is there to take that and apply that to our patients who would like to become healthy? That's a stupid idea,
Mm.
but it's being done.
Mm.
And on the other hand, you also have the lowering of no, what would you say? Kind of the shifting of the ranges, but not because most of the people fit into that in that category, but because there's a pharmaceutical interest behind it um, to manipulate certain blood levels, let's say. And
Mm.
so we just lower the what's considered normal, then suddenly you have a bunch more people to treat. And well, you
Mm.
could back it up with evidence. Certainly, there's you have blood pressure as an example. Too high is bad, and if we lower it, it's like better, let's say. And you have like studies to back it up, etc. But sometimes it's being lowered and lowered and lowered until you could ask yourself the question, like, why do they continue lowering all the time and shifting the ranges all the time? And I don't know
Yeah.
what exactly to do with that issue. It's not trivial.
Mm. It's terrible. I don't know kind of what the answer is there, but whatever we're doing at the moment is not working.
It's definitely not. And I mean, let's talk about autoimmunity, because it's a fascinating topic. And apparently you've also done a deep dive. Well, I haven't really done such a deep dive into autoimmunity, but I hope to do it at one point in time, because I have a family member suffering from Hashimoto's, and that's something which I would to find out what exactly is responsible for that, because that family member didn't have Hashimoto's up until she was like 30, let's say, and then suddenly it was
Mm.
there. So it's like, if it's purely
Mhm.
genetic, let's talk about that, because I would like to hear from you if you have any ideas or hypotheses as to how this emerges.
Yep.
Because let's propose that there is a genetic component at least. Then I don't exactly know what that means. Because does it mean that it manifests itself only in certain circumstances? And then how exactly does it work on a physiological or pathophysiological level? I have no idea. It doesn't make
Mm.
any sense to me.
Well, from what I can see, have
Hmm.
you ever heard of the Swiss cheese model?
Sorry, what's called again?
It, it's called the Swiss cheese model, and I've
No.
heard it be used before a couple of times. And basically, you can imagine a slice of Swiss cheese. It's got the holes in it, and so I think the way that they've kind of concluded that it happens is that yes, there is definitely a genetic component. We all
Right.
have epigenetics and genes. I mean, cells and genes and proteins are constantly being created and broken down, and there are certain things that can turn genes on and turn genes. Some of them are just set, and some of them can be turned on and turned off. So you have the genetic component, and if you imagine a slice of cheese, it's got a hole in it. If you have the genetic component, then you can get through that hole. The next one, I guess, is parents.
Hmm.
What what do your parents provide? The genes that are given straight to you. I mean, I'm not explaining this very well, but then there's another slice of cheese with another hole in it, and then you have another component, which is environment. What are you exposed to? What things in your life could possibly switch on things? So basically, if all the Swiss cheese
Hmm.
line up and all the holes line up, you end up with a condition that is either autoimmune or the way that I see it, though, is that there seems to be a massive influence in if you are consuming something that is breaking down the mucosal lining of your cells, basically what happens is there are certain pathways that can occur when you eat certain things, certain proteins, for example, gluten. Gluten is a lectin. And so what is interesting is when you consume lectins, they are actually able to bind onto carbohydrate. They're carbohydrate binding molecules.
Right.
We have little carbohydrates kind of sticking off every single cell in our body. So they have the potential to bind onto any cell within our body. In fact, they've been shown to be present on like endometrial cells, on thyroid cells. Like they can be throughout the body. And so the problem is if we consume something that does our gut lining. So if you imagine the little cells in your gut lining should be like this. Nothing should be able to get through that is bigger than, I don't know exactly what the size is, but you imagine you want some things to go through these cells and be absorbed, and you want other things to stay in the lumen of the intestines. Certain things will make those cells kind of become more permeable, and those holes, they can create holes that are big enough to be able to let things that should not be able to go through, like big protein molecules that so you will, as food comes through your gastrointestinal system, they will break down to a certain amount so that they can be absorbed.
Right.
And anything that doesn't get broken down enough should not be absorbed into those cells and through those cells into the bloodstream. If your cells are damaged via, for example, lectins, these holes are able to get big enough so that things like proteins, food proteins, can absorb through. They make their way to the bloodstream, and at that point they're exposed to our immune system. And then our immune system can kind of recognize them and go, well, hang on a minute, they're not supposed to be here, so we'll start attacking them. Interestingly, what they can see possibly happens, and I'm still trying to get my head around this as well, but it sounds like this thing called molecular mimicry can occur. So when we have an immune response against an antigen, something comes into our body, it's a pathogen, it's a virus, our body will create an immune response to it, and it will make antibodies so that the next time we're exposed to that pathogen, we know exactly what to do, have a response to it. But what they can see is that if things get through this gut lining that should not be there, they go into the bloodstream and our immune system attacks those. Unfortunately, sometimes these molecules can appear similar to the little special antigens that we have on our actual cells, our healthy cells that say, I'm a healthy cell, don't kill me. But they can look a lot like those. And the body gets confused. And instead of attacking something that actually is foreign, the body attacks thyroid cells or endometrial cells or whatever it is, liver cells. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is what differentiates between somebody being attacked in their liver, what differentiates somebody being attacked in their thyroid. The thyroid does seem to be a very common one. I don't know why that would be. Possibly it could be something that we're eating that is getting through that gut lining, and that seems to look very much like the little antigens that we have on our thyroid cells. So as you can see, it still confuses me, and I'm still trying to get my head around it. But I can see how,
absolutely. That's the reason why we have to talk about that, because I've been thinking about it a lot, because it just didn't make sense, especially taking into account the fact that this is so prevalent. I mean, if it's just genetic, then such a high prevalence wouldn't make any evolutionary sense, because you could say if it's like take what's the name? It's sickle cell anemia as an example. That's a really good example, because it's more prevalent in those regions where you have a higher prevalence of malaria, because for some peculiar reason the one form of sickle cell anemia, provides some protection against malaria. So it provides evolutionary advantage to people that are exposed to malaria, and so that's an explanation for why it's more prevalent in these regions. But I don't see a genetic evolutionary advantage of being, having your own immune system attacking parts of your body. So I think it will be stupid and it will be ignorant, I would say, to only assume that the genetic component is is the only thing that's responsible for autoimmunity. I believe that's an ignorant hypothesis. And so if we, and what you just explained, I've thought about that too, because I believe that's somewhat the hypothesis of Natasha McCampbell. That's like the Russian doctor that, oh, what's happening? You there?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm still there. I think it's, sorry.
Well, no problem.
There we go. Now we're right.
All right. Are you familiar with Natasha McCampbell? With
I
the
have
GAPS
heard of her,
diet.
yes.
She coined the GAPS diet, which is gut and psychology syndrome diet, because she tried to propose a link between the pathophysiological alterations in the gut lining that you, by the way, just delineated with the tight junctions that loosen up, and then things can go through that are not supposed to get through. And then this, in some manner, affects the nervous system, and you end up with psychiatric disease. That's kind of her idea. And you could also make the same argument for every other tissue, apparently, it seems to be, because now if you have, if I understood correctly, you have your gut lining is not, it's not, the tight junctions are not the way they're supposed to be, and stuff goes through that should not end up in the bloodstream. Maybe it's not digested properly, etc. And now, is it that these things have a similar structure to the antigens that are presented by certain cells of specific body parts? So you have antigens on thyroid cells, liver cells, or other cells that just, I think they're being presented on the cell on these MHC receptors, MHC2, I believe it was.
That's correct.
Exactly. And
That's
so
correct.
they present everything, every single bit of antigen that's inside of the cell, being like, okay, so this is our stuff. Don't attack that, because that's us.
Yep.
You shouldn't do this. And then if you have a foreign antigen appearing in the bloodstream, then you have the whole immune cascade going off. And what do you think? Is it more that antigens that go through the gut lining end up in the bloodstream, that they travel to specific tissues and for some reason accumulate there, and that's what initiates the autoimmune response? Or is it more the molecular mimicry, that basically they look very similar to antigens that are already present on specific tissues, and then these get attacked, and the presence of the foreign antigens in the bloodstream is just like that, just happens, and it maybe also triggers some autoimmune reaction, some immune response.
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, when I was looking into, for example, the lectin gluten, and it directly stimulates the proteins, as you were saying, in the gap junctions, it directly stimulates an effect in the cell that makes those gap junctions, the proteins actually begin to unwind. And let's face it, all those little parts of a cell are all made of protein. So if you can unwind, I mean, proteins have the structure that they have because of that they've been winded up in a certain way, so that they take on a certain shape, and that allows them to do their function. If you unwind that, they just basically can't work. And from what I can see, and I can find the images that I tracked down on this note, but it was showing that the cells actually are stimulated to take on certain processes that break down those proteins. And so, which makes me think that, okay, well, this is what allows those cells to come apart, the things get through, and then they go into the bloodstream. If they can do that to if they can do that to the endothelial cells of the gut lining, why could they not do that to a thyroid cell? Could they stimulate a cascade in a thyroid cell that stops that cell from doing what it's supposed to do? Could that affect the way that we're able to produce and send out hormones? Possibly. Could that happen in liver cells, and could it stop the body from being able to produce bile? Possibly. It could do. I think it kind of depends completely on the person, and we know that the blood system is systemic and it can go anywhere. So if those lectins are able to get into the bloodstream, they can go anywhere. So I do think it's a bit of both, though. I don't quite understand the process enough, but I just know that lectins can bind to any cell of the body, because every single cell has carbohydrate moieties on them. So if they can bind, and if the gluten lectin can create that process in a gut lining cell, why can't it stimulate crazy cascades in every other cell of the body? How that then ends up being a lectin binding onto a cell and then the body recognizing it as a pathogen, that I'm trying to get my head around as well. How do we figure out whether or not it is a food source that's causing this molecular mimicry, or if it's an actual pathogen? I mean, I know that there is a strong correlation, for example, with this liver condition that my girlfriend has, primary biliary cholangitis. That apparently is heavily related to having some kind of hepatitis. That's an actual pathogen that they're exposed to. Can that be prevented? Possibly not. If they're exposed to a pathogen and that causes that reaction, maybe it can't be avoided. So that's another thing I'm trying to get my head around at the moment as well. How much of it is diet related and how much of it is actually just pathogens in our environment? My opinion on it is that a lot of these conditions, possibly even if it is a pathogen in the environment that's able to get into and expose ourselves, probably wouldn't be an issue unless they can get into the bloodstream directly. So a very easy way for them to get into the bloodstream would be those cells of our gut lining. If we eat something and those cells of the gut lining open up and allow it through into the bloodstream, that's a very, very good way. And let's face it, the diet that we're prescribed to have is very, very high in, for example, lectins. I don't think they're the only issue, but they are proteins that can cause damage. And I know as a dietetics student, this is the diet that even the health professionals are giving out as being the best diet, and it is completely filled with this one specific type of protein that is extremely hazardous to us. So why would these conditions not be highly due to something that we're putting in our body and eating 6 or 7 times a day?
Yeah,
because that's what we're told.
Lectins is one. Like you could post gluten as another player in that whole thing cascade. And I mean, it has been associated with autoimmunity as far as I can tell. But yeah, there was one thing. Oh yeah, perhaps maybe that's one thing to think about. Maybe the variability and the different tissues that are affected in different individuals, maybe that's where genetic components come into play. Like you have different glycoprotein and you have different things on the cell, and essentially, if you have genetic variety on that level, then on some individuals these proteins are going to bind. For others, they won't. And so perhaps then that's one way to explain a couple phenomena. First of all, that many autoimmune conditions clump together, and basically they do not clump, but many individuals who have one autoimmune condition are more likely to develop others. So that's one interesting phenomenon, which we have no idea how this works. Yeah. And the second one is that not everyone who eats lectins or gluten develops an autoimmune condition. Because that's another interesting question. Like if we know the mechanism, then why doesn't it happen for everyone? Because we have like genetic variability. That's reasonable hypothesis.
And you know what? Just on that note as well,
sure.
When I talk about my past as somebody who is very, very interested in health and has always tried to do the right thing by my health, so I've followed all of the recommendations, which pretty much meant going almost vegetarian, which meant a high plant-based diet. And what's interesting, for example, with lectins is that they are carbohydrate binding proteins. And so sometimes people that are eating a very, very high carbohydrate diet, for example, possibly even terrible forms of carbohydrates, might actually end up doing slightly better, because if they consume lectins with a lot of carbohydrates, they might bind to those carbohydrates and then go straight through your system and you essentially defecate them out. For people, for example, that are maybe trying to do the right thing and doing keto, but they're also eating lectins, they might end up being worse off because they're consuming not a lot of carbohydrates with some low low carbohydrate fruit and vegetables,
Mm.
which have lectins on them, and they could end up doing more damage because there's
Mm.
nothing for them to bind to. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah.
interestingly, I think that could be a part of it as well. Just what you happen to do in your lifestyle uh, I think the genetic component is an interesting one, and I do think some people are just get off a little bit easier somehow. I don't know how. I haven't got my head around that, but I do think as well sometimes, little tweaks in your lifestyle, and you might even think you're doing the right thing, and it can actually make things worse. And if you're doing this 6 or 7 times a day, it adds up.
Yeah. Man, it's a peculiar issue, and it's even difficult to define and describe the problem, because like if our goal is to solve autoimmunity as a problem, then the first step is kind of to define the problem, and we're not even able to do that. So how on earth are we going to proceed from that if we aren't even able to say what it clearly is? Because I mean, we have no clear explanation for that. At least in medical school. I mean, what they say is, yeah, it's like highly genetic, mostly heavily influenced by genetics, and for some weird reason it's still increasing, and it has been increasing over the past couple of decades, and we don't know why, but it's definitely genetic. I'm like, okay, so it's genetic, but it's still increasing. That's an interesting phenomenon. And next is, well, there are a bunch of hypotheses. I mean, they for allergies, at least that was the case, they suggested that you have this observation that people who grow up in a rural environment, they have higher incidences of allergies. And there are a bunch of hypotheses how to explain that. And now another question would also be, how exactly do we distinguish between allergies and autoimmunity? Because it's still a dysregulation of the immune system for reasons we don't understand.
Yeah,
So
and I haven't been able to figure that out either. It's an interesting point, and it's something that's been on my mind a lot, and I can't get my head around it.
well, I believe there's just a bunch of things to read and to learn about in terms of autoimmunity. But okay, you mentioned, let's maybe slightly switch topics. You mentioned you study dietetics, right? When did
Yeah.
you decide to go down that path?
I always wanted to do it right up until sort of my late 20s. So when I came out of high school, I studied nutrition, and but I never used it. I kind of went down a different path, and I met my now ex-husband, and we went to France, and and I just kind of let it go, and then had kids. And so ever since having kids, I decided I wanted to go back and continue to study. And I knew that I wanted to do dietetics because I could see that the nutrition world had changed since I studied. And I feel these days that it's harder to be, I think you can become a nutritionist. I don't want to say easily, because it's not easy, and but I do think the word nutritionist has become quite all or everything. It can be whatever you want it to be, and there's a lot of health coaches out there, and there's a lot of PTs that have
Yes.
done a month's worth of study, and they're calling themselves a nutritionist.
Yeah, you could say
And so
you don't have to necessarily put in a lot of work and time just in order to call yourself a nutrition. I mean, if you want to be a skilled and professional and qualified nutritionist, ideally you learn all the time, and you're a very skilled person who's able to help people to his best of his or her possibilities. But exactly, there's not much you have to do just to call yourself like, I'm a nutritionist. I'm a nutritionist. I've trained for like 2 months, and now I'm a nutritionist. Doesn't require much of an effort.
Yes, and I think there are some nutritionists out there that are heavily knowledgeable and that have done a lot of their own research. But I think there are also a lot out there that are not. And I wanted to set myself aside, and I think becoming a dietitian hopefully would give me that little bit of extra accreditation. But also going into it knowing, I knew back then as well that I would probably have difficulty agreeing with the narrative, and it has been difficult. I'll be honest,
Right.
it's been difficult, but I did go into it knowing that would be the case, and sort of just said to myself, I need those letters in front of my name, and
Yeah.
I just have to do what I can do to get to the other side. But I really would like to change the face of dietetics as much as I can, because I think the more people that can become qualified in this very specific realm can hopefully try to change it. And I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, I follow some people in Australia who have become a qualified dietitian, and they practice the usual standard way. And
Sure.
I genuinely follow them just out of fascination, because I can't see how we can get from the biochemistry that we're learning to following the food pyramid.
Mm,
I don't understand it, because right now, I guess I'm going in with a bit of a biased mind. Maybe I've come in with all the knowledge that I have in my own research, now that I'm topping it up with the biochemistry, I can't see how we can go back to the food pyramid. But I genuinely just, I mean, the subjects, I'll be honest, the subjects that I'm doing the best at are the ones where I just basically tell them the opposite of what I believe, and
right.
I get really good marks. So,
Well, yeah, that's well. I had a quite similar experience in medical school. I also went to medical school with certain, with some ideas that were contradictory to the mainstream belief of, well, let's say, particularly in the realm of nutrition, let's say. So that was also a
yes.
funny experience, because oftentimes when I see a question in the exam, I'm thinking, okay, so what is it that they would like me to say?
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
it.
that's not probably what I would answer, but this is most likely the answer that it would like to hear from me. And so I definitely know what you're talking about. And also what you mentioned, that in order to get to a certain point, you have now to go through that, to undergo that process in order to become someone who will ultimately be capable of providing sufficient help and assistance to people and help them to become healthier, etc. And it's the same for me in medical school, because I think, yeah, there's going to be a bunch of things that I won't like or won't agree with, but I think, we all have our biases. I mean, you cannot say that the mainstream medical establishment doesn't have any biases. I mean, like,
Mm.
they're the ones who perhaps have the strongest biases, and the difference is not. I mean, it would be stupid to say I get rid of my biases, because I think that's almost impossible. It's better, I believe, to encounter new information of any sort with an intrinsic spirit of, well, let's say, exploration. So you would like to explore
Yes.
and maybe not get stuck in your own bubble, because
Yeah.
that what happens to everyone. It's like you have your biases, and your biases are not just random. I mean, the beliefs that you have or that you hold and that I share and the medical system shares, they are based on certain observations, on certain models, and there's something behind it. Now the question is,
Mm.
do you want to get stuck in that bubble forever and don't allow your belief systems to change? Because that'd be a really stupid idea. Because the world changes and
Mm.
we still have problems. And if your model doesn't work, then what about changing your model? You know?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I one thing I really try to hold on to as much as I can, and it is difficult because you can see, I mean, for example, for myself, I mean, I've completely changed my life and my health, and it's very
Mm-hmm.
hard to unsee how much better I feel and to not just assume that that's what everybody needs. But I said to myself at the beginning, if I come out of this course and I truly have learnt that veganism is the way to go, which, by the way, I don't think I will embrace it, and I would like to see myself as somebody who can be. I just want to learn, and I hope that people can see through my Instagram account, for example, that, I mean, I've changed my name recently from Biochem Carnivore to Biochem Nikki, because I don't want to
Yeah.
be held as everybody has to do carnivore in order to get any success. I don't believe
Right.
in that. I'm very specifically very interested in sports nutrition, and
Mm-hmm.
in some cases, I think some people possibly, I'm open-minded to different diets, and I would like to think that at the end, I take a little bit from everything, and come out with a final result. This is what human beings are optimal on. Um, but yeah, I would like to, as you said, I would love to see that more in the medical community, because I think people have for so long believed a certain thing that I think it becomes very difficult for them to turn around then and say, sorry everybody, the advice I gave you for 50 years was incorrect. This is what I'm following now. I understand that would be extremely difficult, but I think people need to accept that things do change and information does
Yeah.
change, and we all want to just be more educated. How can we help each other more? And if that means that you have to accept that you're wrong, I think people should do that more.
Yeah, I mean, look, we had in history, and we could take our the food pyramid as an example, but let's take atrocious historical events as an example, because what ideology, if not if not accepted that you might be wrong in your way of thinking, then this might lead society to very dark places. And we had that in history many times, where a bunch of people die for no damn reason. So I think it's paramount and it's imperative, and there's no way around accepting the fact that you have no clue whatsoever. Like, we don't. Like, look at the world. It's way too complicated. We have no idea. And what science tries to do, and I mean science is very good at that, is providing a factual description of the world that we live in. But no more than that. I mean, you have a bunch of facts, you have a trillion facts, you have way more facts that you can conceive of at this moment. And now I think you dietitians and we medical students and doctors, our job is not to be scientists, because our job is to extract from these billions of facts those that might be helpful in, well, let's say helping patients become healthier. Because there are many facts just exist, and of their mere existence you cannot conclude anything. We have to make decisions by taking some of them and decide which of them are more useful, which of them are less useful, and how do we construct let's say a treatment protocol or anything that would benefit a patient, or in your case a client. And where was I going with that? Well, I think you got my point. The thing probably that I wanted to say is,
I know what you mean.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one thing that appeals to me about dietetics is that I think the trouble a lot of doctors have, and I don't think all of them do it right. I think a lot of them assume things within their patients. But I'll give an example of, a 60-something man comes into their office and they are quite overweight and they have 5 minutes with them, or 10 minutes at most. And what can they do? They can't. I mean, imagine turning around to a 60-something boomer and saying, I want you to eat only meat, or I want you to eat mainly just meat, and don't eat any seed oils, and I want you to swap back to butter. And that person's going to walk out of there and go, this guy's nuts. Yeah. I think one thing that I feel sorry for doctors a lot of the time, and I will say, as I said, I think not all of them do it right. I think some of them just assume that that's their patients aren't going to follow anything that they say, so they just give them drugs anyway. I think it's a shame, because some patients truly do come in wanting to know, what can I do to improve my health, because I'm not happy right now. But I think one advantage of a dietitian is that they have a bit more time with the patient, and they can really spend the time either educating or figuring out what is the issue. And I'm happy to see that there are some. I'm aware of some clinics in Sydney. One is called Sydney Low Carb Specialists, and they spend something like an hour with their patients, especially for this first session. And I think that's incredible, because that's what we need. We need to be able to educate people, and we need more time to educate people.
Yeah. That's so true. I mean, it could not be more true, I believe. And what I've come to appreciate more over the course of medical school is, just what I was talking about, facts and science. I mean, just because you know a lot doesn't mean like anything. It doesn't mean at all that you will become a skilled professional that is going to help, again, extract the useful information, provide it to the patient, and help the patient to discover optimal ways for the patient. I mean, it's going to be maybe different from individual to individual. Most certainly it's going to be different. And discover for them what is optimal in order to achieve optimal health. And well, how do we talk to patients, and how much time we take in order to convey that information? That's such a crucial thing, which I came to appreciate more and more. And I mean, it's being told in medical school to some part, but there is still so much more, because after all, as you mentioned, there is, even we are being told that most patients are very unlikely to stick to recommendations when it comes to lifestyle intervention. So let's keep that aside, because that's not likely to happen. Let's talk about drugs, because that's, well, the better choice, and it's way easier for patients. I mean, that's true. That's true. That doesn't mean that we should not have the conversation with patients, right?
Yes.
So
Agreed.
it's such a difficult
Yeah.
problem, and I would like. Do you want to have clients in the future? What's your goal when after do you after finishing your dietetic studies?
What would I like to do?
Mm-hmm.
To be perfectly honest, I am still trying to figure that out. I know for a fact that I don't want to follow the usual pathway of a dietitian
Mm-hmm.
and work in a hospital with diabetics and tell them to eat 6 times a day, and 65% of that should come from grains. That's certainly where I don't want to be.
Gosh.
um, what I would like to do, I mean, yeah, I would like to help people specifically with autoimmune. I'd like to educate myself more on that. I'd like to work a little bit with athletes too.
Mm-hmm.
Nutrition for athletes, especially, obviously, using low carb approach really fascinates me. And I have seen some really good research on that that's starting to come out. So if I can be part of some research that can re-educate the especially when it comes to elite athletes, that would fascinate me also. But the autoimmune issue really does fascinate me. So if I can help people around the world and travel a
Man,
little bit with it as well, that would be incredible.
man, yeah, like there's so many things that are so fascinating, you could pursue them for the rest of your life. But I
Absolutely.
think the goal is to find a way to combine them all into one, um, into your profession. I mean, you don't have to follow a specific path of someone. Like most do that. That's like most doctors become practitioners, have a practice, and see patients. Doesn't mean they have to do the exact same thing. I mean, I would really like to see patients in the future, but how I'm going to put that into practice, it's a whole separate question. And like, look, I have a good friend in
Mm.
medical school. She is very fascinated with languages. She like studies medicine, and apart from that, she learns like 5 languages or so, like French, Spanish, Russian, and whatnot. And she's actually from US, so German is also foreign language to her. So she is pretty good at that, and she loves learning new languages. And I was talking to her about that. It's like, yeah, she 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 wouldn't like to study anything in the realm of languages, but how about combining international whatever, something that has to do with maybe traveling, because she also likes traveling a lot. How about that, combining that with medicine, because that's apparently what you study, so you seem to be interested in medicine too. And you could combine all that in your profession, and that might be your end goal. So only because
Mm.
you're interested in 10 different things, in your case now, more specifically, um, perhaps you will find a way to combine them all in one end goal. But it might
I
take you
mean,
some additional
and that would be
time.
incredible. I think this sort of situation is fantastic. I think having podcasts, and it allows the information to get out to more people, and it allows you to sort of find ways of helping people. It means, I mean, it will be interesting to see over the next few years actually how this sort of space evolves, and I can see that the idea of when I started sitting behind a desk and having people coming into a clinic, which I work in, possibly isn't going to happen anymore because most people do things online these days. So it will be interesting to see how that chops and changes.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I'm excited to definitely get the message across about flipping things upside down and re-educating people about how wrong the nutrition system is. So as long as I'm doing that, I'll be stoked.
So you have specifically mentioned your interest in sports nutrition, or how these two can how exercise performance can be optimized by means of changing your food intake and the your nutritional quality, etc. What exactly have you encountered in your research? Because that seemed to be also a controversial topic, since so many claim that, yeah, we maybe have been wrong when suggesting that high carb diets are the end all be all for performance, but well, there doesn't seem to be that much difference between low carb and high carb if it comes to like aerobic activity or anaerobic activity. Even here we see that maybe there's not that much difference, but what exactly is your take on that, having gone through part of the research?
So interestingly, I mean, I was only just looking at this recently, and I did a post on it. When they first started looking into, well, when they first started putting the idea together about the fact that we need a high amount of carbohydrates as an elite athlete, it actually came from the idea that, okay, well, we have a thing called glycogen. That's how we store carbohydrates. You know, we store it as glycogen. Glycogen is made of carbohydrates. So it was believed that, okay, well, they could see that the people that had the most glycogen storage had the best capacity when it came to training. So it made sense to them that, well, okay, well, if glycogen is made of carbohydrates, we should just keep eating carbohydrates so that we can stock up that glycogen, and then we'll have better athletic performance. But that was as far as it went. It was kind of like, well, this is so obvious, so we don't even really need to look that much into it.
Sure.
And then, of course, all the studies that were sort of done just showed the same, because they never really looked into what happens if we take the carbohydrates out. But interestingly, there have been a couple of studies that have come out and that have been very well executed. I'm just going to make a point here as well that I think we have this bias that low carb for athletes doesn't work, because most of the studies are not long enough and people are not fat adapted, and their electrolytes are not well organized, which is a big part of athletic performance, is getting your electrolytes right. And so of the studies that have actually been done correctly, and these athletes have been actually properly keto adapted, they can see that, number one, with the same kind of training, I think, I'm not going to quote the name of it because I can't remember it, but where they actually did muscle biopsies before a 3-hour relatively high intensity run, and they had two groups. One was high carb, one was low carb. They did muscle biopsy before and directly after, and then after a couple of hours, I believe. And so the high carb group obviously fueled prior high carb, and after completing the 3 hours, the high carb had a high carb source, low carb had no carb, and then a couple of hours later they checked their glycogen again, and at all 3 points they found no difference between the two groups, which is fascinating, because
it was muscle glycogen, right?
Muscle glycogen, exactly. Okay. So they actually did muscle biopsy, and that's the best you can get. That's the gold standard. Wow. And they found no difference between the two groups in all 3 biopsies, which is truly fascinating, because it just goes to show that the body's capacity to make its own glucose and, of course, therefore glycogen, it comes down to, we make it as we need it. And I think that's why low carb athletes can do incredibly well, because they don't hit that wall that you usually would when you run out of your glycogen stores. And I mean, the theory behind, when I do exercise phys at uni, the theory is that if we just keep making sure that we are stocking up that glucose and never tapping into the glycogen more than we need to, we will always have enough glycogen to have enough power and force. But I can tell you for myself as well, I mean, we've been doing some peak power tests over the last semester, and, you know, one RM. We've been doing, you know, Wingate tests. And I can tell you, I was able to completely keep up with all the 20-year-olds in my class that I know for a fact are doing high carb. And when I brought up the topic with my teacher, he basically said, I didn't say I was doing it. I just said, what would you say if somebody that was doing low carb tried to do this? And he said they wouldn't be able to.
Oh,
And I
wow.
sort of just had a little giggle to myself. But I think the problem as well with athletes is that if you imagine that you're an elite athlete, and then you decide that, okay, I'm looking into this low carb thing, that could be cool, but you've been following a certain training protocol and nutrition protocol for your whole adult life, and you've got to a certain level of eliteness, could you really face the idea of, what if I just try this other thing? It could possibly affect my next game or my next performance. Or should I just continue doing what I'm doing, knowing that that works? Most people would probably just continue doing what they're doing, because they would not want to sabotage the possibility that it might not work, even though that they might have read that it can be better. But I do take my hat off to some of the athletes that I have seen that have taken it on and have seen fantastic results, bearing in mind that I'm guessing they are getting their electrolytes correct and they are fully fat adapted.
Right. One question came to mind. Yeah. Do you think there are specific differences between, in terms of sports performance, between being, well, average carbohydrate or high carbohydrate and low carb or ketogenic? Because personally, well, I've perhaps never been really ketogenic, but I've certainly been more low carb and less low carb, and most of the time I've been training on an empty stomach and in a fasted state, and sometimes I just experimented with eating some glucose and like honey, some like fruit or something like that right before the training session, 1 hour before the training session. And I didn't feel any stark differences between empty stomach, not empty stomach, high carb, low carb, which is not to say that there aren't any differences. It's just both felt roughly the same. I still prefer to train on an empty stomach, just because of the fact that if I eat, I tend to eat a lot, and then I'm like heavy and I cannot really train properly, because my training are usually body weight, and if you train mostly body weight and you're heavy, then you can't do anything. You just feel
Yes.
weak and heavy. So maybe that's like the only reason. But in terms of performance, I haven't personally felt much difference between more carbohydrate or less carbohydrate. Maybe it's because I'm young and my body just does whatever my body feels right at the moment. So what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so personally for me, I was doing very, very strict carnivore for a good probably year and a half. I would say almost 2 years, and then I did the honey experiment that everybody's been doing. My sort of training is more at that time, especially, is more heavy towards the powerlifting kind of training. I personally found that when I started I didn't see any change between when I came from the high carb, the standard high carb, with my powerlifting, to going low carb. I felt like I had the same amount of energy, but then adding the carbohydrates back in via honey, I actually found that my performance started to drop a little bit.
Oh,
I
really?
think mainly because, yeah, and that was an interesting one. And I tried to look into why that would be. And I guess it would probably be that my body became more used to then tapping straight into the glucose again.
Right.
Over time, what I can see happens is that, the longer you do low carb, the more fat adapted you get. And then your body starts to partition that little bit of glucose or glycogen that you do produce for the organs that really do need it. And muscles and parts of the body that can be hybrid, like the muscles, they then kind of go, all right, you guys have that, I'll work off that. And what I could see possibly was happening with me, I'm not saying this would happen with everybody, but maybe it could have been that my body was going back into, okay, well, let's face it, this is an easier thing to break down. We'll go back to the glucose because it's in our system now, and we'll stop being as fat adapted maybe. I certainly, when I dropped the honey back out, I felt better with my training. Could that be because I'm doing heavier lifting as opposed to lots of endurance? I would assume actually it would be the other way around. I would
Right.
assume that endurance would be better being more fat adapted. Well, yeah, I guess it depends on what sort of type of training you're doing. But for me personally, I found it harder with a bit of glucose in there.
Okay.
Yeah, so look, I don't know. That's a big question for me. I think I'm not saying that I think people don't need carbohydrates. I think it depends on who you are, but I do wonder if some of the benefits that you're
Well,
getting
it
from
depends on what you mean
having
by
carbohydrates.
needing carbohydrates. I mean, we certainly need them. The other question is if you
Mm,
need to eat them. I mean, we do need them, and that's what changed
exactly.
my way of
Yes.
thinking about carbohydrates, because I was for some time I wasn't like strict anything, never, not vegetarian, not carnivore, but I was in all these spaces. That was really funny because I was continuing doing my own thing. I was shifting my diet. Maybe when I started the whole journey, I was heavily into vegetables, and I was shifting my diet to like 80% vegetables, and was way too much, and that was horrible. And then I was more into low carb. I shifted my diet away from carbohydrates. Then I was more into animal based, and I started incorporating more animal foods. But I wasn't really strict anything. That being said, where was I going? Man, I always go off on a
With the, do
tangent.
we need to actually
Yeah,
consume
exactly,
them?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
was when I was in the keto low carb space, and I would still say that I consume below average carbohydrates. It's certainly not like 60% or something ridiculous like that. But I was convinced that they're the enemy and like no one should eat them, etc. But then I came around physiology, and I'd be like, okay, everyone is talking about, I encountered a piece of cognitive dissonance in the keto low carb people, because they always were. That's like the mainstream argument from the keto space. It's like there is no essential carbohydrate. That's me. It's like there's no essential carbohydrate. I'm thinking, yeah, but you also say saturated fat is good. However, there's no essential saturated fat. I'm not saying saturated fat is bad, but these two things don't go along. So if you think there is no essential carbohydrate, you have to make the same argument for saturated fat, and everyone would stop eating saturated fat. You don't say that. So why don't you say that? And I thought, okay, what about shifting the paradigm about essential and non-essential? Because if we say essential, we presume it's good and important. If we say non-essential, we presume that's bad. We shouldn't eat it because. But it's like, for me, it's the other way around. Non-essential means so crucial that you can survive without it because your body synthesizes it on its own. So it's so
Mm,
damn important that you cannot survive. You wouldn't be able to survive without that molecule for one day. That's how important it is. And I thought, okay,
yeah.
well, if I look at that from that perspective, I see the value in glucose, and I think it's stupid to demonize it as mere poison. Well, that's my thoughts on the necessity of glucose. So I think it's crucial to have some because we clearly wouldn't survive without any. The other question is, do we need to consume any? And that's a different question.
And and I haven't really come to the answer yet when you're talking about athletes. I think for the average person that isn't active, I don't think you need to really consume any. Having said that, personally for me, I
Mm-hmm.
guess because I've become so insulin sensitive now and my insulin is just so low all the time, the one problem I do have these days is that I find it difficult to hold on to my electrolytes at all. So I think possibly for somebody
Yeah.
like me, because I'm young and very, very, very active, a little bump here and there helps me retain the electrolytes a little bit more. And you're absolutely correct. I agree with you completely because people do demonize any form of glucose, and they
Mm.
freak out about the whole gluconeogenesis and, oh my god, if I eat too much protein I'm going to stimulate gluconeogenesis. And I think what people
Oh
forget
man.
is that at any point in the day, no matter how fat adapted you are, no matter how non-fat adapted you are, you are tapping in and out and in and out the different fuel sources. Once they get into that Krebs cycle, they're exactly the same.
Mm.
They all are exactly the same. Once you get in there, it doesn't matter where it's coming from. Either it's coming from amino acids or it's coming from glucose or it's coming from, fatty acids. They're all doing the same thing. And so even somebody who is not fat adapted at all will start to create ketones at some point after a few hours. It will take longer in some people, depending on how metabolically healthy they are. So I do think you're completely right. It's not about demonizing glucose because glucose is, let's face it, the body loves to use glucose. It's
Sure.
the quickest because you don't have to go into the Krebs cycle. You don't have to go into the mitochondria. You can go through glycolysis and you can create pyruvate and you can create lactic acid. So we need it absolutely. And Yeah, you're right. The question is, though, do we need to consume it? And I think for athletes, is it my question would be, is it more about, do we consume the carbohydrates in order to do better with sports performance because of electrolyte imbalances? Could it be that, for example, somebody like me finds it harder to retain electrolytes without any bumps in their insulin? So could it be that I would do better in sport performance? Somebody like me would do better with sports performance because if I eat that little bit of glucose, I retain my sodium, potassium a bit better. Therefore, my performance increases. Could it be that? Possibly in some people that could be part of the issue. If you're not eating anything at all, maybe you're just not retaining any electrolytes. And I think electrolytes are a massive thing for sports performance.
Oh, yeah.
Could it be that they're actually, I guess what I'm coming to, the more I learn about it at this point, I'm seeing that there could be some benefit in train low. How do they say it? If you train on a low carb diet and then when you're about to do your game or your performance, then you add a little bit of carbohydrates in there. And like I said about the muscle sparing the glucose, if you do that, you become so fat adapted that parts of the body, like the muscles, do decide to use fat over glucose most of the time. They'll spare it for other parts of the body. But then you give it a little bump of glucose, it's like, bam, I've suddenly got all this energy that, I don't even know what to do with it. So I do think there could be that could be beneficial for some people as well. So
it's maybe like training in a fasted state, getting better and adapted at training in a fasted state for an extended period of time, and then when a competition comes along and you need more rapidly accessible energy, then you just get that glucose and your body be like, yeah, thanks a lot, you have been taxing me in this stressful fasting state for such a long time, and I finally can, and then maybe you'll be able to perform better. So okay, so that's an interesting question. Do you so would you say it's more using the low carb ketogenic approach as a tool to well, as you described, to prepare your body, to prepare them in the training period, and then you introduce glucose and carbohydrates in the setting of a competition? So is it more using it as a tool, or do you really believe there are some independent benefits of the low carb approach for performance per se?
I think there can be in some people depending on their sport, but I think most of the benefits would be once you are fully fat adapted and then you add it in as a supplementary thing when you're about to do your performance. And I think that will depend as well on just the person in general. I think some people, for example, if maybe they have an autoimmune condition, they add carbohydrates from something that is high in, for example, a lectin, that might end up reducing their sports performance because it aggravates their autoimmune condition. So I think it depends on completely who you are. I think if you feel like your sports performance is slightly better using carbohydrates, I think go do it. It's just worthwhile acknowledging whether or not, is it a mental thing that it makes me feel like I'm performing better, or is it genuinely that I am performing better? And
or
that's
the
something
electrolytes. The electrolytes are probably a huge one.
The electrolytes.
That would be a third one, like placebo or nocebo effect, and the actual benefit of glycogen, like maybe that's a thing, maybe not, and then the benefit of retaining. We had kidney in medical school recently. That was fascinating because, suddenly it made more sense to me. Everyone is talking about, and Paul Saladino is talking about electrolytes and insulin. I'm like, how does this shit works? And then it made a bit more sense. Are you aware of the exact mechanisms? Because I think in medical school they told us something about the sodium-potassium channel in the tubules and how they are being, I don't know, more active by insulin signaling. So if you have high insulin, it activates the sodium-potassium channel, and you have more potassium being retained and more sodium being retained and more potassium being excreted. And I believe that's one explanation for why Paul developed heart palpitations, because he had so little insulin signaling that he lost a bunch of sodium, retained way too much potassium, and too high. Maybe he had some latent hyperpotassemia or whatever you would call it, and then he had some heart palpitation because of that. But is that the mechanism, or there's anything else?
Um, as far as I can see, that would be the main
The main one.
mechanism.
Okay.
You need insulin to stimulate those sodium channels, and in fact, I mean, as far as I can see, hypertension is it's an insulin issue. You know,
Right.
if you're not stimulating those insulin requiring transporters, you won't retain sodium. And I know for myself, for example, if I do an OMAD, if I only eat once a day, if I do that 2 days in a row, my insulin must go down so low, and that's when I really notice dehydration. So yeah, absolutely, there are four transporters in the kidney,
Mm.
and they require insulin signaling, and that's
Oh,
why I think
okay.
sometimes a big having enough of a bolus, isn't it? Sometimes for people, having just protein can be enough, but you can't go around saying you should only eat fat and not eat enough. You shouldn't eat much protein because you don't want to stimulate insulin. There are
Oh,
certain
jeez.
circumstances, like you said, where you need insulin to be stimulated
Mm.
because otherwise you'll become dehydrated. And I agree with you completely about Saladino. I think that could have been part of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking about the mechanisms because, and that's also what I wanted to ask you about because I haven't figured it out for myself. I'm so damn interested
Mm-hmm.
in biochemistry and physiology, it just drives me crazy because if there's one problem I can't understand, I dig into the damn biochemistry until I get to the core of the issue. And then first, it doesn't make any sense because maybe you're aware of that curve. If you know very little, you think you know everything. And then as you start
Oh
learning
yeah.
more, it goes down. You'd be like, oh shit, I don't know. I know zero. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing. And then maybe at the
Absolutely.
end it rises a little bit. It'd be like, okay, now I have a rough understanding of this whole issue, but it's far from complete. It's anything but complete. And I haven't figured out for myself why it is that I am so fascinated about learning more about biochemical pathways and mechanisms. Because it's like I could just I could just I could just learn the end result and study the not the exact biochemical mechanisms, just the vague pathophysiology, how it roughly happens, and then what I am to do about it. I mean, that would be sufficient, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
not, and maybe that's the reason why. But how did your interest for biochemistry and physiology come about? What would you say?
Um, it's I think for me it's mainly it stemmed from wanting to fix issues myself, and I could see that if I mean, I went to doctors many times over the years for my asthma and or my hay fever or whatever condition it was, my gut problems, whatever, my skin problems, like you name them.
Mm,
And they just basically said, look, you can either take this drug and hope that it might fix it, or you can basically just continue going on as it is.
mm,
Um, and so I kind of thought, you know what, if I don't figure this stuff out, nobody's going to help me. And nobody, I mean, people care, people around you care, of course, they want to see you healed, but nobody's going to do it for you. And I think unless you go off and do the research yourself and dig and dig and dig and dig, nobody else will do it for you. And you need to experiment and play around. And I'm exactly with you. I think any moment that I get on my own, that I if I start looking into a topic, I
mm.
can't stop until I've found the answer to it. And that's called passion, and not
Yeah.
everybody loves biochemistry that much. But my God, if you're interested in it, go for it because it is truly fascinating, right? It's
Yeah.
so
Well,
fascinating.
it's I don't know why. Like it's just molecules doing stuff and signaling pathways and whatnot. I mean, I don't really know what it is about that fascinates me. I've been talking with a friend about that recently, and I couldn't provide her with an answer. It's like, yeah, I like it a lot, but I don't know why. It's
I
cool. It's
think for
interesting. I enjoy the
me,
seminars and the lectures where they discuss a bunch of physiology and biochemistry. And I don't know if I'm good at that because we also had a discussion with her about what comes first. Is it skill or interest? Because after some one of these two comes first, then it's a self-perpetuating positive feedback loop. You get better and that's why you like it, and then you do it more and you get better and you like it more,
yes,
etc. But what comes first? Like who knows? Maybe I was good at biochemistry, that's why I liked it, but I'm not sure about that, so whatever.
I think it's the passion first. I think if you're passionate
Yeah,
enough about something,
that's
you
my
can make
tendency.
yourself good at. Yep,
That's my tendency.
yep.
But sometimes you randomly discover something. I mean, how do you discover your passion? How do you discover that? You
Well,
randomly do
yeah.
something, and then the question is, You try something out, and do you like it first, and then you start pursuing it? Or do you find out you're good at that, and that's why you start pursuing it? You know?
And I think part of it, and I think a lot of people possibly that have gone through this health journey or fixed, resolved an issue, then they start thinking, now, hang on a minute, why did that happen? And that's where I'm at now. I mean, I've always been interested in biochemistry and nutrition, but for me, it's like, it's just pushed me so much further into it, because now I can see that, hang on a minute, you can heal these issues, but why can you heal them? What has caused the healing? And I haven't come to the answer totally myself yet, but I mean, you can't say that. I mean, for example, last year, for the first time in my entire life, as far as I can remember, I was able to hold a wattle in my hand, which is an Australian plant that is just renowned for being. It's got like this powdery pollen that comes off it, and it's just renowned for being just hideous for hay fever. I was able to hold it, breathe it in right up into my nose, and I didn't get any hay fever at all. And I think once you see those things, you can't say that is in my mind only. That I have completely healed myself of this condition, and then you start to think, but how did that actually happen? And I think the more you learn about the human body, as you said, the more you realize that you don't understand, but also the more you have respect for the human body, and the more you think the human body is capable of so much. And I would say my absolute favorite organ that I've discovered, and I never would have thought it, is the kidney. I think the kidney is the most incredible organ. It does so much, and we don't give enough credit to it, what it's doing continuously through the day. And it makes you realize that the human body is just exquisite.
Man, yeah, like that's my conclusion from medical school so far, because we had these different organ systems and the different pathways, and you're probably familiar with the biochemical map, or I don't know how it is called, where all the pathways are depicted on one map, and you have this tiny Krebs cycles in the middle, and you have the whole map around it, and it's like, geez, and these things happen all simultaneously, every second, every day, for 100 years, roughly. And so that's really something to think about. And that's why, I find it very humiliating, because, no, humbling, sorry, that's the wrong word, humbling, very humbling. Humbling, yeah. Humility is the word, but it's humbling. Because because it's like we doctors think we can interfere at one point and nothing else happens, and we help and we change one thing and everything else still is the same. It's like, no, you have 10,000 things working at once, and there's maybe even more pathways that we haven't even yet discovered that happens for some reason, and you influence everything. And how are we so sure that we do the right thing? So that's what I find so humbling about the human body, because in the end, our body knows best what it does. And I think we, as doctors and also dietitians and nutritionists, we don't have enough appreciation for the crazy, ridiculous complexity of the human body. It's just beyond.
Absolutely.
It's beyond what we could grasp.
I agree completely, and I think there are certain circumstances where, of course, if somebody is unfortunate enough to be born with a genetic condition or exposed to something that has upset their, caused a mutation. But I think majority of the time, as you said, the human body is so incredibly, like, there is so much going on at every second of the day. And I think usually when the body is left to do what it needs to do, it can figure it out if we don't micromanage everything, because we try to micromanage it as if we understand it completely, and we just don't. And, for example, calorie counting, you try to micromanage the calories that you're putting into your body, but in fact, you have absolutely no idea what's going on with how we break things down, and people forget about what else is going on, or they just don't even know that other things are going on. And so, I completely agree with you. I think people need to respect the human body, and a lot of the time try and just let it do its thing, and it will hopefully sort it out on its own.
And what's so fast?
Yeah,
sure, yeah. Well, sometimes the interventions help, and what's also fascinating is the question is, how far down should you go in the level of analysis? So you could start very superficially, I mean, look, the interventions. You you impose, let's say, nutritional intervention on a patient or on a client, that's not, you don't tackle a specific pathway. You know, it's very broad in its effects, and it affects every system at once. But for some people it helps, for some it doesn't. But if you now have, sometimes you have some types of medicine that interfere with one specific molecule, or we think it does, maybe it does more than that, but in theory it interferes with one specific molecule or with one chemical reaction, and the effects are from that. So that's so fascinating. You could interfere with one tiny thing and the effects come from that, or you do something which affects everything at once, and you know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah,
that's something to think
absolutely.
about, because we eat a food and all these things just happen in our body. Our body takes care of these things on its own. We don't have to think about it. It all happens automatically. And well, I believe I don't try to make a point here. It's just talking about my fascination about the human body, because that's also maybe a reason why I love doing these podcasts, because I have no idea. I truly don't. And that's why I just need to have guests on to help me to understand certain things, because, well, what do I know?
Yeah, and I respect that. I think the people that are the smartest in the world are the ones that can accept that, you know what, I don't know, and I want to be taught, and I think we need to I mean, one thing that I'm starting to see is that majority of health conditions, especially the most serious ones, I mean, the blood related disorders and things that are absolutely crippling to somebody and can make them unable to do everything on their own, could just, in fact, a lot of the time are just down to a single enzyme either not being present, or being overactive, or being underactive, or, you know, it usually is just one little enzyme. And which makes me appreciate as well that um, people, when they choose to change their lifestyle and they're able to take on, for example, an animal-based diet, how possibly upregulating just a single enzyme via what you're eating, or via it being able to be produced easier because you've got enough, for example, vitamin K that you were missing, how things can actually change in the body, and how much of a cascade that can have on your entire health, just because this one enzyme has now become available to your body. And, you know, enzymes are so incredible, because if they're not functioning properly, not only can you not break things down, you can't make them, you can't replace cells, you can't. Enzymes are everything. And I think, what am I trying to say? I'm just trying to say that one tiny weeny little thing in the body that is disrupted can have gigantic effects on the
Yeah.
body. And I think we all need to respect more what
I think
occurs
that
on
I think
every second.
the essence is you have this beautiful ecosystem, which is our body, and it consists of billions and maybe more parts, which we partly have discovered, partly we didn't. And you could look at all these parts separately and say, this is one enzyme, that's the second enzyme, that's one molecule, that's one molecule, that's one cell, that's one cell, and they have on their own very important function, and together they form this organism which is capable of pursuing things and walk around and live and reproduce and whatnot and think, and I mean have consciousness. Like, what's that? How does that come about?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. We have neurology now. It's just insane. I've no idea what to make of that.
And
Neurology and what happens, consciousness, and like how we sleep and what happens there, and it's just like, in theory it's just electric signaling, but apparently it's not just that, because we have like consciousness, we can think, and we act as if we have a free will. I mean, do we have a free will? That's a good question, but we certainly act as if we do. So that's a funny thing. And what you just mentioned with the enzymes, it's like they all form this organism, and the function of the organism is predicated on every single part that it's made of. So every single enzyme, they form that. But if one thing doesn't function, then the whole thing breaks apart, and that's also extremely fascinating.
And a lot of enzymes require a single nutrient
Yes.
that we need to absorb enough of in order to allow it as, for example, as a cofactor. I mean, for
Mm,
example, the B vitamins. If we don't have enough of the B vitamins, we literally cannot break things down, and we can't make energy properly. And so, what I find though exciting is I used to always see the human body as a scary thing
mm,
that where magical things happened, and I would
mm,
worry that, but what if this happens, and what if this happens, and yeah, that's the case. Sometimes things do happen, but what I can see though is that the human body, in most healthy cases, I'm not saying somebody who might have a genetic condition or something, but I just think it's exciting to think that the human body, I now understand, is in constant renewal, constant
mm.
breakdown, constant renewal. It's constantly creating new things and getting rid of old things. And if you set it up in a way that allows it to do those functions, something that you're suffering with one day can possibly be resolved. And as I said, there are some conditions that are more difficult, or that may have gone too far in order to fix it. For example, very, very late stages type 2 diabetes. Okay, it
Yeah.
gets to a point where sometimes those cells are so damaged and fibrotic, they
Or
cannot
certain
do what they need to do.
cancers.
Certain cancers, but in a lot of cases, and a lot of people that we see in this community, I think it's exciting to think that these people can, within a few years only. I mean, it's been about 2 years for me, and I guarantee you, people, the conditions that I have had all my life,
Mm.
I just don't get them at all anymore. And the body can renew itself, and the body can heal itself. So it's exciting, I think.
That's that's a great place to stop. That's a very positive and
Very positive.
empowering. Yeah, yeah. Because there's way too much negativity right now in politics and in the world. So let's introduce some positive vibes. And I think kind of making a point about the unbelievable complexity of the body and what it entails in terms of potential, because
Mm,
complexity, and as you said, you first thought of it as a scary place. That could entail two things. It's like, oh help, it's scary. I'm rather not confronting this thing, or it's huge, tremendous potential. And so that's maybe
mm.
something to think about, and also for the future for you as a dietetic community and medical community. Although I actually wouldn't like to separate them, because our end goal is kind of similar, to make people healthier. And it would be way better if we would learn to work together as opposed to
Mm.
in separate entities, something like that.
Absolutely. Agreed totally.
All right. So yeah, it's been awesome talking with you, and it helped me to clear up certain things, but also it helped me to come up with new questions because it's like I now understand that there's even more I don't know, and it's good. Like I like
Absolutely.
that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing these podcasts.
Me too. Me too. I feel like what's great about these sort of communications is that you've done research down avenues that I haven't, and I've done research down avenues maybe you haven't, and we're coming in and educating each other and educating the immunity community, and
I'll be talking too much
I
about
think it's
autoimmunity.
a little. It's constantly on my mind.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on.
Awesome. Have a great day.